Hi, this is Scott Allen, and in this module I want to demonstrate the box model of CSS and HTML. The box model is important to understand because every HTML element on your web page will produce a box. You cannot always see the size and dimensions of these boxes, but divs, paragraphs, anchors, headers, lists, and the rest of the elements are all producing boxes, and quite often you'll have boxes inside of boxes. Understanding how to size and arrange these boxes is a large step towards understanding web design with CSS. A div, like every visual HTML element, will produce a box, and there are three key box properties you can influence with CSS. First, there is the border around a box. Most borders are not visible by default, but you can control the width, style, and color of this border. Secondly is the padding. Padding adds space between the border of a box and the content of a box. In this case, the content is the word div, and we have quite a bit of padding that is pushing the content inwards away from the border. Lastly, there is margin. Margins are the space between a box and any adjacent elements. While padding pushes content inward, margins push boxes away from other boxes. Before I show you how margins work in a demonstration, I want to point out that boxes have four sides. I know that's not a groundbreaking discovery. You probably knew that before you started watching this video. But in the context of CSS, it's important because you can set the border, margin, and padding settings for a box differently for each of the four sides of a box, or you can set them all to the same values. Let me show you how this works. As a demonstration for this module, I want to show you some of the things you can do with CSS to make a collection of list items appear dramatically different, so it's not just a collection of list items that appears a bulleted list as they do now. Because right now we have a style sheet included, but the styles are empty. And before we get to anything fancy, I want to start off and give us an understanding of border, margin, and padding. Let's first go in and add some background color to our unordered lists so that we can precisely see the box that is being drawn by that unordered list. I'll set this to a light gray color and refresh the browser, and there we can see the box. And let me go ahead and zoom in so that we can see some of the changes we're about to make. And so that we can compare the box represented by this UL element and the box represented by one of the list item elements, let me go in and use some CSS to go in and say, find me the list item inside of UL, but find me a very specific list item. What I'm going to do is look for the nth child, the third nth child. We haven't covered this syntax in this module, but this is literally going out and saying, count the number of children inside of a UL element and find me not the first one, not the second one, but the third one. And what we'll do here is we'll say, set the background color to a slightly different color. The last two hexadecimal digits represent the amount of blue, so it's going to be slightly less blue, and we get sort of a goldish brown color there. And now that we can clearly see the dimensions of the box drawn by the list item, let's go in and set the padding to that element to be 10 pixels. Remember, padding pushes content inwards away from the outer borders, so when I refresh the browser, you'll see that Blueprint now appears at least 10 pixels in from the left border, 10 pixels down from the top border, and 10 pixels up from the bottom border. It does extend all the way to the right. We'll talk about that in a bit, but this is the effect that padding would have. Now you'll notice that the box doesn't extend fully to the right. It doesn't reach the window of the browser. We still have some white space here on the right and the top and the left. Where's that white space coming from? It comes from some default padding and margin rules that are inherited from the user agent style sheet. We talked about that in the last module, and it's one of the reasons that some people will use a CSS reset or just define a style rule that says the default padding for all of my elements should be 0 pixels, and the default margin for all of my elements should be 0 pixels. And now when I refresh, you can see that our box drawn by the unordered list is now flush against all the borders of the window, or at least the left, the top, and the right borders. The box is only drawn to a height that will fully encapsulate all of the content that's inside. Now let's add a margin of 10 pixels. this margin is going to push that list item away from the adjacent list items, the one above it, the one below it, and it's also going to push it away from the left side of the window. In fact, you can see that without that margin, we're not even seeing the little dot that typically appears in a bulleted list. Let me increase the margin just a little bit more to make sure that dot fully appears, and I'll show you the proper CSS approach to removing that. That is to set the list style type, and from here you can actually pick what sort of icon you want to appear. What I'm going to pick is none, so that when we refresh the browser, that dot doesn't even appear. There are no bullets associated with this list anymore. Many times you'll see this abbreviated to just list style none. That will have the same effect. And so that we can more clearly see this effect, let's remove this nth child selector and just apply the background color, padding, and margin to all of the list items. And let's also draw a border around each of them. So let me say that the border style is going to be a solid line. Notice you can also pick from a double line, a dotted line, a ridged line. Solid is one of the more popular selections though. I'm going to set the border color, the color of that line, to be black. And I'm also going to set the border width in pixels so that we'll have a 2-pixel border around each of these. And now it should be very obvious that the space inside of that border is the padding setting. The space outside of that between the elements is the margin. And we're already starting to see that we've transformed this list into something that doesn't quite look like a bulleted list anymore. As I mentioned earlier, every box has 4 sides, and the border, margin, and padding syntax in CSS allows you to set properties for all 4 sides equally or independently. The first line in this rule on the screen is only setting the padding on the left side of all LI elements. The second line in the rule is setting the margin on all 4 sides of the LI element, and it does so by specifying the margin at the top and then working clockwise around the box. So we have top, right, bottom, left. This is a shortcut syntax you can use instead of setting one value with margin-top and one value with margin-right and so forth. The border specification also has a syntax you can use to set the appearance of a border using a single line. It's the width, style, color. So the third line in this rule will give us a solid black border with a width of 3 pixels. And notice this is only the border bottom, so you can set the border appearance on the 4 sides independently also. The side of the box that you target with all of these rules will always be one of top, right, bottom, or left. Let's use this syntax in our demo page. Here in the demo page, let's make a few changes. And the first thing I'm going to do is take the background color that's currently assigned to the UL element and assign it as the background color to the body, so that we have a nice consistent light gray background throughout the page, and that's easier on the eyes. And now let me remove the margin and padding so that we can start to work with them. One of the great things about margin and padding is how you can use them to precisely position some of your elements, just by adding a few pixels here and there. Without padding, without margin, everything just goes to the top of the window. It's flush against the sides of the window. I do want to add a little bit of space back in there, but not as much as we had. So let's just have a margin of 5 pixels on all 4 sides, and that pushes the elements a little bit away from the sides and a little bit away from each other. And with the padding, I want to do something a little bit different. I want some more padding on the left side of the box to push that content away from the border, but I'm not so concerned about the other sides. From the top, let's just say 3 pixels. The right and bottom I don't care about, so I'll just say 0 and 0. But from the left, let's use a 10 pixel padding on the left to push those elements further away from the left-hand side of the box. And now let's also try some things with border. So I'm going to use Visual Studio to type into these bottom 3 lines and make them all to apply only to the border bottom, which gives us just that thin black line along the bottom. But I know now that I can shortcut this style, and I can just say border bottom is going to be a 3 pixel solid black line, so you can specify that as a keyword, or RGB values, as we talked about earlier in this course. And when I refresh, I have that solid black line at the bottom of the elements. And I want to do something a little bit different for the left border. So what we can say is border left is going to be a 10 pixel solid that looks a little more maroon. And now what we have is a bit of an interesting effect where the border is actually going to call attention to these 4 list items. One of the subtle aspects of the demo we've been looking at so far is the space between list items. In the last modification that we made to the style sheet, we specified a margin of 5 pixels around all 4 sides of a list item. This ultimately meant that the top list item was at least 5 pixels away from the top of the page, but notice that a list item in the middle is also just 5 pixels away from the top list item. If the top item has a bottom margin of 5 pixels, and that middle item has a top margin of 5 pixels, why isn't the space between the list items adding up to a full 10 pixels, 5 from the top, 5 from the bottom? The answer is that in HTML, when top and bottom margins meet, they will overlap or collapse. Technically, they will overlap until one of the margins touches the border of the other element, meaning you'll always have a margin that is the maximum amount of the bottom and top margins that are meeting. In this case, both the bottom and the top between a list item is 5 pixels, so we have a 5 pixel margin. This behavior only applies to vertical margins. When we stack elements next to each other horizontally later in the course, we'll see that horizontal margins do not collapse or overlap. The collapsing vertical margin makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because the margin for our list items will make sure that we push away from the top and the left of our window. But when we have a list item in between 2 other list items, we still want that same consistent 5 pixel margin. We don't want both margins to add up to 10 pixels and push these further apart than they are from the left and the top. So vertical margins collapse, and we like that behavior. The largest margin between these 2 elements will set the space between them. So far, the boxes we've been creating with list items have extended to the far right of the screen, which is how most elements are wont to behave unless you constrain them with a width. You can set the width of an element inside of a rule. It's a simple property value, and like most measurements, you can specify pixels, millimeters, inches, or a relative width like 50%. Keep in mind that when you specify an exact width, like 250 pixels, you are specifying the width of the content area. Any border, margin, or padding that you add will add to the width and require more space. On the box we're looking at, if we say the margins are 5 pixels on all 4 sides, and we've set the content to be 250 pixels in width, then the total size of that box that is rendered is going to be 260 pixels because we add the 5 pixel margin on both the left and right sides. In the demo application, let's see what happens when we set the width of our list items to be 180 pixels. You can see that shortens them up quite a bit. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also set this to a percentage, so I could say that they should be only 40% of the page. But let's go back and let's set this to about 150 pixels. And that's just enough space to fit everything inside of here. And then I could also go in and say the text alignment, all the text inside of these should be centered. We'll talk more about text and typography in the next module. And now imagine that I wanted to create an image that would align perfectly with the box that we've created. How can I calculate the total width of the box? Well, I'd have to take the width of the list element content, which is 150 pixels. I'd have to remember that there's a left border of 10 pixels. That puts us at 160. There's also a 5 pixel margin on the left and the right, so that adds another 10 pixels. Sometimes doing these computations can be a little bit tedious. Fortunately, the developer tools that I showed you in an earlier module that are available in Chrome and Firefox and Internet Explorer, they will have a place where you can see for any given element what sort of layout or metrics it has. Here inside of Chrome, I can see that a list item content is 150 pixels. There's 10 pixels of padding, 10 pixels of border, and 5 pixels of margin on the left. There's also 5 pixels of margin on the right. And I could add all those numbers up to get the total width of that box.